Raiders trade rumors are hot because the NFL trade deadline is just a few hours away. I'm Mitchell Renz, host of the Raiders Report, and coming up here on today's show, let's look at some players that the Silver and Black could potentially target if they want to go out and get somebody, because let's face it, for the Raiders to move on from Luke Getsy, Rich Scangarillo, and James Craig, this tells me that this is still a team that's looking for players trying to potentially win now. So at the end of today's show, I'm going to tell you some names that maybe the Raiders could trade for. Before we get into the names that the Raiders could trade for, we got to talk about the names that I think that the Raiders could move on from. Because at 2-7, the logical thing to do, and I get it, it's the Raiders, doesn't always mean that logic's going to come into play, but the logical thing to do when you're 2-7 is to be sellers. So if it was me, I would try to sell some players here on the Silver and Black. And coming up on today's show, I'm going to tell you who you could potentially move on from, who are some players that are going to be getting called about, because the NFL trade deadline is today at 4 p.m. Eastern time. To make sure that you don't miss anything going on around the deadline, hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications. Jeremy Chugs and I, we're going to be going live in just a few hours. In fact, we're going to be going live at noon Eastern time today. I know it's a little bit later on or earlier on for some of you guys on the West Coast, but there's going to be a lot of action. I saw one report that said you could see 6 to 7 wide receivers get dealt on the deadline day. Not the Raiders, but just overall wide receivers. It's going to be a fun day. And also, there's nothing else going on today, so make sure you tune in. Let's go to the first player here that I think could potentially get dealt. And I will say at the time that I'm recording this video, I do not have an update on the injury status of Andre James, which, let's face it, is going to be a big contributive factor of whether or not he ends up getting dealt. I will say that if a trade isn't completed for Andre James, I think you just got to put him on the bench for the rest of the season. Jackson Powers-Johnson proved to you in Week 9 that he's the best center that we have on this team. Quite frankly, he's the best offensive lineman that the Raiders have on this team. And if you're the team like the Raiders and you can go out and potentially start your center right away from the jump, I think that you have to consider doing that. So what does that mean for Andre James, a player that just got a 3-year, $24 million deal? It tells me that if a team offers you just about anything, you got to be willing to do it, because right now, I would say that he's got to be one of the weakest links to this offensive line. But when you talk about this line, James is not going to be the only player that gets brought up. You could also bring up a lot of other players and a lot of injuries to discuss, because the Raiders took a lot of injuries, especially in the ankle department this past week against the Bengals. Another player, though, that's going to be getting a lot of trade talks is Kolton Miller. And if Thayer Munford would have played a little bit better this past week against Cincy, and when I say a little bit better, I really just mean like at all, the Silver and Black are very high on DJ Glaze, and they like Munford, but there's no way that you can trade away Kolton Miller after seeing the way Munford played if the Raiders are actually trying to win, if Antonio Pierce is actually trying to save his job. But the reason why that you could do it is he's got zero guaranteed in 2025, and he wants a new contract. I'm telling y'all right now, Kolton Miller wants a brand new deal. And if you're the Raiders and you don't plan on giving him a brand new deal this offseason, well, then you might have to trade him right now. He has struggled with injuries this season. He's banged up yet again. 30 years old next year. He's a good left tackle, and there are teams out there, if healthy, could use Kolton Miller. Some other offensive linemen that you at least got to just consider. We already talked about Miller and Andre James. Dylan Parham, I would say, is going to be another very hot commodity on the deadline. I have heard by multiple NFL teams that are showing interest in Parham because he can do so many different things. He's played center. He's played right and left guard. He even played right tackle back in college. Thayer Munford's going to get calls. Cody Whitehair is going to get calls. Another person that it depends what the injury looks like is Andres Pete. There are a lot of teams calling about linemen, and I'm not saying that linemen get moved often, but the Raiders did just fire their offensive line coach. Therefore, as far as I'm concerned, all the linemen not named Jackson Powers-Johnson, not named DJ Glaze, probably up for sale. So how about this? You guys can tell me, if the Raiders trade away one player, who do you want it to be? The number one player that I want the Raiders to trade is, well, how about, I'll tell you after this YouTube ad break. The number one player that I want the Raiders to trade is Gardner Minshew. And I know it's very unlikely to happen. But the reason why that I want it to happen is because I have seen what Gardner Minshew looks like. And don't get me wrong, there's a part of me that is a little bit intrigued to see what Minshew could potentially look like when Luke Getsy isn't the one calling plays, when Rich Scangarillo isn't the quarterback coach. And I do think that Minshew got put into a really shitty situation, but I'm also at the point of this year where I'm like, let's just see what we got in Desmond Ridder. Let's just do it. And then when Aiden O'Connell comes back, Aiden is more than likely going to be the starting quarterback of this team. So that means, what the hell do we do with Minshew? It actually helps the Raiders out more now if you trade Minshew right now this week, today, instead of waiting until the offseason to try to trade him, because no team's going to trade him in the offseason, which probably means the Raiders are just going to end up more than likely having to cut him. And if they have to cut him, teams would only have to pay Gardner this year if they traded him $324,000. If you're the Raiders, his cap hit next season is $14 million, and you're going to have to eat $6 million if traded. LV's going to have to cut, if they cut him this offseason, it's going to cost them more. My point is, does anybody here think that Gardner Minshew is going to be on the Raiders next season? I don't know how you possibly think that he can be. So with that logic, it makes more sense to trade him, though I don't know if there's any team out there that would. If you would, maybe you get a 7th-round pick. The team that I would say is the most likely to make a trade, the Indianapolis Colts, because they did just bench Anthony Richardson. And who knows, maybe Richardson ends up getting dealt. Let's go to another player that I think could end up getting traded today on the deadline. I'm not saying that any of these players are getting traded. I'm simply telling you which are the names that I think are the most likely. John Jenkins, defensive tackle, 35 years old, and is going to be a free agent in 2025. If at any point you know that a player is going to be a free agent next season and you don't plan on bringing them back, you should consider trading them right now. I also want to see what some of these younger defensive tackles have. Like, Jenkins is a really good player, and I love the fact that he's a member of this team. But if I'm the Silver and Black at 2-7, I need to start evaluating all my other players. Carter, Lalu, Matthew Butler. This is not going to be a year where the Raiders are going to win a lot. But then again, on that double-edged sword, it's like, well, if Antonio Pierce is trying to save his job, then trading away John Jenkins doesn't make all that much sense. Yes, is he getting up there in age? But Jenkins is still able to provide a solid rotational defensive tackle who stepped up once Christian Wilkins went down. I don't anticipate that Wilkins is going to be coming back at any point this season. But another player that you could look at, and he's on screen, it's Adam Butler. And out of all the defensive tackles that the Raiders have, Adam Butler is another one that is just the you're going to get the most in return. He's the best DT that we have. So if a team calls about John Jenkins, and let's say that they're willing to offer you a 7th, if the Raiders are fully sellers, you go, well, can I get a 5th-round pick for Adam Butler? Or if a team calls about Adam Butler, then you could say, hey, well, what about John Jenkins? Let's go to another player that I think could potentially be dealt. Divine Deablo, going to be a free agent in 2025. If the Silver and Black were to extend a linebacker, if it were between Deablo and Robert Spillane, personally, I think that they would stick with Spillane. So the fact that you know that you're not going to bring back both of these guys next season, and the fact that you drafted Tommy Eichenberg this year, that tells me that one of those linebackers is the odd man out. Therefore, I believe it's Divine Deablo. Therefore, I would be open to trading double D's this trade deadline. Let's look at some honorable mentions here, and simply, most of these names are just free agents. The only ones that are not free agents that you see pictured are Jakobi Meyers and Zamir White, and the only name, which I've said multiple times here on this show, that I have heard the Raiders have gotten phone calls about is Jakobi Meyers. With the amount of NFL teams out there looking to potentially make deals at the wide receiver position, it shouldn't surprise anybody that Jakobi Meyers has popped up. But Nate Hobbs, Tre'von Moehrig, Robert Spillane, a lot of potential free agents next season for the Raiders, and if you don't plan on bringing them back, well, then you at least got to think about trading them. But with Hobbs, his injury that I sustained, Robert Spillane's not 100% healthy right now either. Harrison Bryant's been a little bit banged up. What does the future hold for Michael Mayer? Lots and lots of question marks around the Silver and Black. Coming up here next, though, probably the part of the show that I think that you guys are going to like a little bit more. It's players that we could trade for. And I love Raider Nation because y'all are just like me. When you trade players away, you don't get as excited about it. When you add somebody to the nation, I do. I get way more pumped up, way more fired up about that. Also, what I get fired up about is saving money and being able to create lasting memories. Quite frankly, if the Raiders stink this season, you might as well try to create some lasting memories, and I think one of the best places to do that is with Game Time. I can still remember the very first baseball game I ever went to with my dad. Mets, Cubs, Sammy Sosa hit a home run. Mike Piazza hit a home run. Those are memories that'll live with me forever, and I will always cherish them. I don't remember if the Mets won. I don't remember if the Cubs won. And you know what? If you're watching a Raiders game right now, maybe it's best down the road that you don't remember who wins and losses because I don't know if they're going to win. So I want you to create some lasting memories, get some awesome prices on some tickets, and download the Game Time app, create an account. Use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply again. Create an account, redeem code CHATSPORTS, that's CHATSPORTS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's Game Time. The reason why I think people will like Game Time, last minute tickets and flash deals. Game Time picks is where you're going to be able to see the best ticket prices at that event. If you're somebody that likes to do some window shopping, or when you go buy anything, you go look at the clearance rack first, or you want to find the sale deals, well, that's what Game Time's here for. If you want to see where you're sitting in the app, views from your seats, lowest price guaranteed, and this is why I love Game Time. It's the perfect app for anybody out there in Las Vegas. So one more time, this link's going to be available to y'all down in the comments, down in the description. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply again. Create an account, redeem code CHATSPORTS for $20 off. So let's start talking about some players that you could potentially see the Raiders go out and get. Again, 2-7, the Raiders should not be buyers. But 3 coaches were just fired, and I can't blame Antonio Pierce for trying to save his job. I can't blame Tom Telesco for trying to save his job. First name is Mike Williams. The Raiders already tried to make a deal for Williams when they sent Davante Adams to the New York Jets. Mike Williams has a lot of connections with Tom Telesco. Telesco also, back a few years ago, gave Mike Williams his contract extension when he was a member of the Los Angeles Chargers. Let's go to another name here that gets brought up very often in trade rumors. I'm not saying that the Raiders are interested in Kendrick Bourne, but if you wanted to go maybe with a little bit of a cheaper option in terms of how much you have to give up to go get him, because he's not really being used all that much in New England. The Patriots aren't trying to win anything right now, and for the Raiders, maybe you pair him up with one of his buddies, Jakobi Meyers. You got Trey Tucker, you got DJ Turner. This is a very weak wide receiver room, and shit, as I'm even looking right now, Tyreek McAllister, he's not even a member of this team anymore. The point is, they continuously cycle in guys over and over and over again. And if you're looking for a wide receiver, I'd say the one that's most likely, Mike Williams. Another option, Kendrick Bourne. What about defense, Mitch? The Raiders just gave up 41 points. I don't see the Raiders adding anything on the defensive side of the football unless it's this guy right here, Azeez Ojulari. And that's only because of his connection with Patrick Graham. That's only because I know that this Raiders team believes that they still need to be able to go out and add a little bit more edge rushing. You have to be impressed by what K'Lavon Chaisson has been able to do over the past few weeks. I mean, Chaisson, quite frankly, I would say has been one of the more reliable edge rushers for the Raiders this season. He's posting a win rate of close to 30%, which is pretty damn high. Tyree Wilson, I think, has stepped up. Max Crosby is going to continue to do his thing. They like Charles Snowden. You haven't seen a lot of Janarius Robinson, but if this team's going to make a deal for anybody on the defensive side of the football, I'm going to say that it's going to be for Azeez Ojulari, and even that, it's not going to happen. The Raiders are 2-7, man. All right, so let's keep on looking at some other positions that the Raiders could trade for, because literally, I think the position that's the most likely if the Raiders want to make a deal, it's at the offensive line position, and that's only because of the amount of injuries the Raiders sustained this past 2 days against the Bengals. The Raiders had 8 different offensive linemen play against the Bengals due to different injuries, and they've had a lot of injuries on the O-line. One name that continuously gets brought up is Nate Davis, and I'll be real, Nate Davis isn't very good. You're not going to add an offensive lineman at this point for the Raiders at 2-7. It's not going to be one of the big-name linemen that I see being mocked out there all the time. The Raiders are going to go for a cheap lineman that they can add a little bit of depth if and only if the current line that they have are not healthy enough to go out there after what they think in Week 11. Michael Dieter, this is going to be another name, and this is not really somebody that's getting brought up all that much by the Commanders, but Dieter does have at least 1 or 2 ties on some coaching staff members here for the Raiders. On top of that, can play center, can play guard, offers you a little bit of flexibility, and for the Commanders, that's a team right now that maybe they're looking for, extra draft capital for next season to continue to build what they got going on, because Dieter right now is just sitting around, 5 games played, 1 sack allowed. Just saying, somebody to keep in mind. Another name that gets thrown out there is Andre Dillard, former first-round pick. And back in 2019, I liked this young man a lot. And when he was a member of the Philadelphia Eagles, I used to always say he wasn't really getting any playing time because of how good that line is. He is a member right now of the Green Bay Packers still. Not really getting too much work going. So if I'm the Raiders and I want to build on a little bit of upside, maybe you can look at a guy like Dillard. Another player that was drafted in, 7 overall in the first round, no doubt, from Alabama, was Evan Neal, who currently is a backup player on the New York Giants. And I know a few of the Raiders players, Jermaine Illuminor, Greg Van Roten, they went to the Giants. There's a part of me that wonders, could the Raiders figure out a deal that sends, I don't know, maybe Andre James to New York, and the Raiders figure out a way to add Evan Neal? This is more like if you're concerned about the health of Andres Pete and Kolton Miller, who both went down with injuries. Darren Munford was really bad. Maybe Neal needs a fresh start, and maybe Andre James also needs a fresh start. So get down in the comment section right now. If the Raiders make a trade, who should it be for? Who should the Raiders make a deal for? The name that you're about to hear is probably the name that gets brought up to me the most when I ask this question. And a lot of people hit me up on social media. To me, if the Raiders are going to make a trade, you make a trade for an offensive lineman, or you try to figure out a way to bring in a wide receiver that's not going to cost you too much. If it was up to me, I wouldn't trade for anybody because I want to focus on next season and continue to build for next season. There's two players, I should say. There's two players that get brought up a lot in trades. The first one that I always get asked is Bryce Young, because obviously the Raiders quarterback situation is a nightmare right now. And is Bryce Young better than Desmond Ridder, better than Gardner Minshew, better than Aiden O'Connell? I don't know, but he was drafted really high. And if you want to see what your new coaching staff has, and if you're worried that you're not going to be able to get a top quarterback in next year's draft, well, could you look at potentially Bryce Young, who I think Carolina would be open to the idea of moving on from him. And if you're the Raiders, maybe you have to give up a third, maybe a fourth-round pick for him. Carolina might want more. I'm just saying that's what I would offer. Another player that I don't think would cost you a lot is Anthony Richardson. And let me be clear here. If you trade for Anthony Richardson, I think even if you were to trade for Bryce Young, I don't know if I would put either of those quarterbacks out on the field this season. If you trade for them, it is you're planning down the road. You're just seeing what you can get, and you're planning down the road, and maybe you can turn these guys into something down the road. Because I know this. I'm not trading for Anthony Richardson or Bryce Young, and I'm not putting them out there behind this offensive line with these wide receivers, with this talent overall, with this coaching regime. That's not putting your players in the best situation. Therefore, I don't see why the Raiders in hell would try to trade for a quarterback. And I know that some of y'all want the Raiders to trade for a QB, but my job here is to sometimes sit down and tell you that it's not going to happen. I don't think that the Raiders make a deal today. I've been wrong before. I'm going to be wrong again. If they do end up making a deal, we're going to be live here on the Raider Report, so make sure you subscribe. Make sure you turn on those notifications, and I'll see all of y'all noon Eastern time today.